In the autumn of 1942, somewhere in the grey North Atlantic, a German U-boat commander pressed his ear against the cold steel of his vessel's hull and listened. He had heard something strange, a sound that made no sense, a mechanical groan that drifted through the water, like the ghost of a ship that wasn't there. His hydrophone operator could not identify it. It wasn't the rhythmic churn of a destroyer's propellers. It wasn't the sonar ping of a hunting frigate. It was something else entirely. Something that seemed to follow them. Something that seemed to know where they were. He ordered the boat to remain submerged. He ordered silence. He ordered his crew to wait. And so they waited, burning through their precious battery reserves hour after hour, while above them the Atlantic convoys sailed on unmolested. No torpedo was fired that day, no ship was sunk. The U-boat eventually crept home, short of fuel, short of answers, its captain deeply unsettled by a threat he could not name. What that commander did not know, what would not be known for decades, was that the sound he had heard was largely a fiction. It was the product of a bluff so audacious, so technically primitive in certain respects, and so brilliantly conceived in others, that it stands as one of the more extraordinary deceptions of the entire war at sea. The British, facing near certain defeat in the Battle of the Atlantic, had decided to frighten the enemy into inaction using sound itself as a weapon. The project was called the Foxer, and its story is one that most histories of the Second World War pass over almost entirely. To understand why such a strange solution was necessary, you have to understand just how desperate the situation had become by 1942. The German U-boat fleet, operating under the tactical doctrine known as Rudeltaktik, the Wolf Pack, had turned the North Atlantic into a killing ground. In the first 6 months of 1942 alone, German submarines sank over 3 million tons of Allied shipping. The numbers are almost incomprehensible. Tankers carrying vital fuel, merchant vessels laden with food and ammunition, troop transports, all were falling victim to an enemy that could strike from beneath the waves and vanish before any response could be mounted. Britain's survival depended on those Atlantic convoys, and those convoys were being torn apart. The Royal Navy had developed a range of countermeasures. ASDIC, the British sonar system, allowed surface vessels to detect submerged submarines with some reliability, and depth charges gave them a means of attacking once contact was made. But the U-boats had their own technological edge. German acoustic torpedoes, the G7ES, known to the Allies as the Gnat or German Naval Acoustic Torpedo, homed in on the sound of a ship's propellers. A U-boat commander no longer needed a precise firing solution. He simply needed to point his boat in roughly the right direction and launch. The torpedo would do the rest, drawn unerringly to the loudest mechanical noise in the water. Escort vessels, the very ships tasked with protecting convoys, were prime targets. Their powerful engines made them acoustically irresistible. The Genet was, in effect, turning the Royal Navy's own technology against it. Something had to be done. The question was what? The answer emerged from an unlikely combination of sources: the Admiralty's experimental stations, the scientific officers attached to Western Approach's command, and a broader culture of lateral thinking that had begun to characterize British wartime innovation. The key insight was elegantly simple. If the acoustic torpedo was chasing noise, then the solution was to give it something noisier to chase, something expendable, something that could be dragged behind an escort vessel, rattling and clanking through the water, screaming out an acoustic signature so loud and so compelling that any incoming torpedo would abandon its original target and chase the decoy instead. The device that emerged from this thinking was the Foxer. officially designated the FXR, and its construction was, by the standards of wartime technology, almost comically straightforward. At its core, the Foxer consisted of two metal pipes, each roughly 1.5 meters in length, connected by a length of cable and towed behind an escort vessel at a distance of approximately 200 meters. The pipes were designed to clatter and bang against each other as they were dragged through the water, producing a continuous, irregular mechanical noise. The acoustic signature was, according to estimates, several times louder than the propeller noise of a typical escort destroyer. In theory, any acoustic torpedo in the vicinity would detect the Foxer before it detected the ship and home in on the decoy rather than the hull. The manufacturing process was deliberately simple. The Admiralty needed thousands of these devices, quickly, and they could not afford a complex production chains. Metal pipes, cable, and basic connectors. These were the components, fabricated at facilities across Britain and distributed to escort vessels as rapidly as stocks could be assembled. If you are finding this interesting, a quick subscribe helps more than you know. The Royal Navy was, in essence, going to war with something that a moderately competent plumber might have knocked together on a weekend, and it was going to work. The first operational deployments of the Foxer began in September 1943, coinciding with what the Allies had already designated as the critical phase of the Battle of the Atlantic. Escort groups operating on the North Atlantic convoy routes began towing the devices as standard procedure whenever intelligence or circumstance suggested U-boat activity. The results, while difficult to assess, with complete precision given the nature of classified wartime records, were striking enough to be noted at the highest levels of Allied naval command. In several documented instances, acoustic torpedoes fired at escort vessels detonated harmlessly in the wake of the towed Foxers, having successfully been drawn away from the ships they were targeting. The psychological effect on U-boat crews was, according to post-war interrogations and German naval records, considerable. When a Gnat torpedo failed to hit its target, when it exploded in empty water, or appeared to detonate against something that was not a ship. German commanders were left confused and alarmed. They could not easily understand what had gone wrong. Some concluded that the British had developed some form of torpedo detection system that was physically destroying incoming weapons. Others simply became more cautious, more reluctant to commit to attacks, more inclined to break off contact and withdraw. That caution, that hesitation, translated directly into convoys reaching port unmolested. The Foxer was not, it must be said, without its drawbacks. The noise it produced, so effective at attracting acoustic torpedoes, also made the escort vessels towing it significantly harder to operate as anti-submarine platforms themselves. A destroyer dragging a Foxer through the water was producing so much acoustic interference that its own ASDIC equipment became compromised. The device that protected a ship from attack simultaneously degraded the ship's ability to hunt the submarines that might attack it. For convoy commanders, this created genuine tactical dilemmas. You could protect your vessel from acoustic torpedoes, or you could hunt U-boats effectively. Doing both at the same time was extremely difficult. The Americans, facing similar problems in their own operational theaters, developed a parallel device known as the fanfare. A slightly different approach to the same principle, though the underlying concept was identical. The convergence of Allied thinking around acoustic decoys reflected a broader truth about the Battle of the Atlantic, that the war beneath the waves was, at its heart, a battle of noise management. Whoever could control the acoustic environment, whoever could be heard when they wanted to be heard, and go silent when silence was needed, held the advantage. German engineers, aware that their acoustic torpedoes were being countered, attempted to adapt. Modified versions of the GNAT were developed with altered acoustic sensors designed to discriminate between the irregular noise of a Fokker and the rhythmic signature of a ship's propellers. The technical back and forth was constant and exhausting, a cycle of measure and countermeasure that characterized so much of the technology war. But the Fokker had achieved something beyond its immediate tactical purpose. It had introduced doubt. It had made U-boat commanders uncertain. And in a campaign where confidence and aggression were essential to the German strategy, uncertainty was a weapon in itself. The broader impact of the Fokker on the Battle of the Atlantic is genuinely difficult to isolate from the many other factors that shifted the balance of the campaign during 1943. The introduction of long-range patrol aircraft, particularly the Consolidated Liberator, closed the notorious mid-Atlantic air gap that had previously given U-boats a sanctuary beyond the reach of Allied air cover. Improved radar, the cracking of German naval communications through the Enigma program at Bletchley Park, the development of ahead-throwing weapons such as the Hedgehog depth charge. All of these played their part. The Fokker was one thread in a much larger tapestry, and yet it would be a mistake to dismiss it. In the specific context of the acoustic torpedo threat, a threat that had genuinely alarmed Allied naval planners and caused measurable losses among escort vessels, the Fokker represented an effective and rapid response. It was developed, produced, and deployed in a fraction of the time that more sophisticated countermeasures might have required. It exploited the fundamental vulnerability in the German weapons design, its reliance on acoustic homing, and turned that vulnerability into a liability for the weapons operators. No major museum exhibit celebrates the Fokker. No dramatic reconstruction has recreated the moment when a German acoustic torpedo, following its programmed instincts, swung away from a destroyer's hull and chased a length of noisy pipe into oblivion. The device does not lend itself to visual drama, but somewhere in the records of Western Approaches Command, in the operational logs of escort groups crossing the Atlantic in the autumn and winter of 1943, the evidence is there. Convoys that arrived, escorts that survived, attacks that failed. Think again of that U-boat commander in the autumn of 1942, pressing his ear to cold steel, listening to a sound he could not identify. Within a year, the British had transformed that vulnerability into a strategy. They had decided that if the enemy was going to listen, then Britain would give them something to hear. 2 pipes on a cable dragged through the dark water of the Atlantic. Simple, cheap, almost absurd, and it worked. The Battle of the Atlantic was won through 1,000 innovations, 1,000 decisions, 1,000 acts of ingenuity and determination, stretching across 5 years of unrelenting conflict. Some of those innovations are celebrated and famous. Some have been forgotten entirely. The Fokker sits somewhere in between. Known to specialists, unknown to most, underappreciated even by those who are aware of its existence, but it stands as a reminder of something important, that in war, the most effective solutions are not always the most sophisticated ones. Sometimes the enemy is afraid of noise, and sometimes the right response is simply to make more of it.